Welcome to More or Less, Debating America's Role in the World, a series of online debates brought to you by the Charles Koch Institute and the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program. This series aims to foster vigorous, civil, and constructive debate on the future of American foreign policy. We break down big topics into bite-sized pieces, one question at a time.
Hello, my name is Adam Twardowski. I'm a research assistant at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to the next installment of our new series, More or Less, Debating America's Role in the World, where we invite leading scholars and practitioners of foreign policy to engage with each other in short exchanges on the most pressing questions confronting policymakers. Today, our debate will focus on the question, what should U.S. policy toward Afghanistan be? This year, of course, we will commemorate the 19th anniversary of the United States invasion of Afghanistan following the attacks of 9/11. It's been a complicated journey in many ways since then, and given the considerable loss of life and investment of treasure to sustain U.S. operations, the war in Afghanistan continues to provoke plenty of debate here in the U.S., not just about history, but about what we should be doing there in the future. And that is what we'll be talking about today. Representing Brookings today, we're pleased to have Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow and director of research in the Foreign Policy Program, where he specializes in U.S. defense strategy, the use of military force, and of American national security policy. He co-directs the Security and Strategy Team, the Defense Industrial Base Working Group, and the Africa Security Initiative as well, and he has long written about Afghanistan and the region broadly. And representing the International Crisis Group, we're very pleased to have Laurel Miller today. As director of the International Crisis Group's Asia program, Laurel leads the organization's research, analysis, and policy advocacy about and in the region. Prior to joining the International Crisis Group, she was a senior foreign policy expert at the RAND Corporation. And before that, she was deputy and then acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the Department of State. Today's rules are very simple. You each have 5 minutes to state your case before it goes to the other side. You may not interrupt each other, and we have the power to mute you, and we're not afraid to use it. And then we will go back to each side for a 2 to 3 minute rebuttal, and then back to each side again for a 2 to 3 minute concluding session. So today we're going to start with Mike. I'm going to hand it over to you, Mike. Then the question is, what should U.S. policy toward Afghanistan be? You have 5 minutes starting now.
Thank you, Adam. And it's a pleasure to be on with Laurel Miller, of whom I'm a big fan and think that she, like so many other Americans and others, have done great work in Afghanistan. And that's why my argument is going to be in favor of patience and largely staying the course, even with the expected frustrations of the next few years of a peace process that I think at best will take half a decade to produce any kind of power sharing agreement between the Taliban and the government of President Ashraf Ghani or his successor. And I think we should actually be patient, keep several thousand U.S. forces, along with a couple thousand more NATO forces, keep several $1 billion in aid flowing to Afghanistan throughout that period, unless the government does something so egregious that we can no longer partner with them, or unless somehow peace is concluded more quickly than I expect. I do not want to empower the Taliban to stonewall or run out the clock or make us feel that somehow they are all of a sudden good partners in peace, when in fact I do not expect them to be very forthcoming in the peace process early on, because I think they overemphasize the strength of their own hand. They believe that the Ghani government is a puppet of the West and would fall quickly without American and NATO support, other donors as well. They believe, therefore, that if they can persuade us to leave, that we will do so in a way that then facilitates their rapid takeover of the country. And I don't want to play into that narrative. To put it more bluntly, the Taliban may have a few people willing to make peace, but basically they're the bad guys. And the Ghani government has a lot of corrupt officials who are not particularly adept at running their country, but they are still trying to be the imperfect democratic rulers of a country that we've been trying to help get back on its feet, and that has invited this international presence through the conscious decision and will of itself. And therefore, relatively speaking, that government and the civil society and political society around it, they're the good guys, and we shouldn't get confused about which side we're on in this negotiating process. In fact, at some point, we may want to encourage the creation of a more neutral arbiter or UN mediator in this peace process that is now about perhaps to finally begin. because I don't think the United States can or should play a truly neutral role. I think that would misinterpret our stakes and our interests. I would also say, taking a broader perspective, this has been a very frustrating war, a very frustrating mission, despite the outstanding work of our own President at Brookings, John Allen, who was commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan for some time, despite Laurel's efforts, many others. We have not gotten where we want to be. And I would criticize the Afghan government, including the government of President Karzai before Ghani, and many others. And I think the United States made a lot of mistakes. But I still would say we have not been attacked again from Afghan territory or in any plot originating on Afghan territory since 9/11. That by itself is at least a certain threshold of minimal accomplishment. And frankly, it's a pretty important accomplishment that the United States has not again suffered that kind of attack. We should not minimize the importance of that accomplishment, nor should we minimize the fact that even though the Afghan people and the Afghan government and society have made many mistakes along the way, this is also a group of people that helped us win the Cold War. You know, we've been at war in Afghanistan almost 2 decades, as Adam pointed out in his introduction. The Afghans have been at war for 40 years, twice that long, going back to the coups and counter coups that led to the Soviet invasion. But then the Afghan Mujahideen worked with the Americans, Pakistanis, Saudis, Emiratis to essentially fight the Soviet Union and ultimately help us prevail against the Soviets in the Cold War. That was no mean feat. That actually helped end the Cold War globally. And while I don't think that a moral commitment to that memory or that legacy should guide and dominate American policy today going forward, it still is something worth remembering. The last point I will make in terms of 2 more points about going forward. One, I think that a U.S. military presence in the range of 5,000 troops, which is apparently where we're headed by the end of this year, according to Secretary of Defense Esper, who has spoken to this question in recent days, that is a perfectly sustainable strain on the American military. It is nothing like the force that was 20 times larger, the 100,000 strong U.S. force we had in Afghanistan a decade ago, when Americans were on the ground doing most of the fighting themselves. Our role today is more limited. It's more technical. It's more about advisory and training missions. It's more about counterterrorism. And I think we can and should sustain that if need be until we get an acceptable outcome in the peace process, which could be 5 years or more. Secondly, Laurel Miller has, to my mind, and I don't mean to butter her up and make her lose her competitive edge before she speaks in what is being framed as a debate, but she has, to my mind, written the single best thing about how to think about the kinds of political compromises that will be needed in any kind of a realistic Afghan settlement. She wrote that through the RAND Corporation. It came out, I believe, earlier this year or late last year. I recommend it to anyone and everyone. It's a lot of good thinking, which shows just how hard it's going to be to get these 2 sides, the Taliban and the Afghan government, that both see each other as illegitimate and fundamentally weak, to get them to compromise on how to meld their security forces, how to divvy up cabinet positions, how to handle education and Sharia law and protection of minority rights and interaction with the international community. We're going to need some time for them to wrestle through those kinds of huge, huge issues. And I don't think we should be in a hurry to believe we can somehow front load this negotiation to conclude in the next 1 to 2 years. So unless there's a flagrant violation or abuse of power by the Afghan government, I think we should settle in with roughly 5,000 US troops throughout much, if not all, of the next presidential term in the United States and give this peace process the time it needs to have a chance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for starting us off so strongly. Laurel, over to you. Same question. What should U.S. policy toward Afghanistan be? Your 5 minutes starts right now.
Thank you. And Mike, good tactical move there on complimenting me before I spoke. First, U.S. policymakers need to accept several fundamental facts and proceed on this basis. The first one is the U.S. did not defeat the Taliban and is not going to. I think for many people focused on studying Afghanistan, that might seem to go without saying, but more broadly, I don't think that that reality has been fully internalized. Second, the U.S. has not been able, as longstanding prior policy aimed to do, to ensure the construction of an Afghan government in Kabul that could defeat the Taliban on its own. Third fundamental fact, a U.S. departure from Afghanistan without a peace deal would likely result in a protracted and intensified civil war in which many Afghans would suffer. And finally, it's crucial to recognize that the conditions for a peace deal are only going to worsen. They're not going to improve. And so the suggestions that some have made, and I don't mean Michael here, that one should go slow in a peace process is not something that I would recommend, because you're not going to get a better peace deal tomorrow, next month, next year, or 10 years from now by sticking it out in Afghanistan than could be had in the near term. This means to me that the U.S. should continue to pursue a peace deal as it has been doing over the last year and a half, but at the same time recognizing that any plausible deal that would result will inevitably legitimize the Taliban politically and give them a major share of power. Afghans are going to have a broad set of goals, no doubt, in any peace negotiation. And as Michael mentioned, hopefully there's one that will be starting in just a few days from now in Doha. But the U.S. goals, I think, need to be limited, specifically to getting a cessation of hostilities and to getting a new set of governing arrangements in Afghanistan that are agreeable to Afghans and that can hold together unified security forces. Anything else, I think, from a U.S. perspective is extra and not essential. U.S. policy also needs to accept that there is no long-term future for U.S. military forces in Afghanistan. And here's where I think Mike and I have some differences of view. If the peace effort fails and the U.S. military stays anyway, then it will be back to fighting the Taliban in a war without foreseeable end and in partnership with an increasingly fragile government in Kabul. I would agree with Mike from a technical, literal standpoint that 4,000 to 5,000 U.S. forces is sustainable in the sense of being affordable by the U.S., but I don't think it's a sustainable scenario for the U.S. to keep those forces at that level in Afghanistan indefinitely, which would mean perpetuating indefinitely a war which has seen the Taliban as ascendant, a trajectory of ascendance that I think would continue. Moreover, I think it's important not to look at sustainability only from the perspective of affordability by the U.S. Sustainability also has to be considered from an Afghan perspective. And Afghan losses and erosion of their capabilities is continuing to increase at record levels. Now, if the peace effort does succeed, then I think there's little to no chance that the Taliban, as well as many other Afghans who don't associate themselves with the Taliban, would agree to the continued presence of foreign forces on Afghan soil. And that's the second reason why I don't see there being a long-term future for U.S. forces in Afghanistan. The third is that all of the important countries in the region, except for India, oppose the idea of an indefinite U.S. military presence in what they see as their backyard. This includes China, Russia, Iran, and with some complications, Pakistan. That opposition, particularly on the part of Iran, China, Russia, could become active over time if the U.S. looked like it was proposing to stay indefinitely in Afghanistan. And finally, I would say, I don't think there's endless amounts of time for the U.S. to continue to maintain a troop presence at this 4,000 to 5,000 level while peace negotiations are being pursued. First of all, it's important to recognize that the U.S. did agree in the agreement that it signed with the Taliban February 29th in Doha that it would completely remove U.S. forces and NATO forces from Afghanistan by sometime next May. Now, none of the deadlines in that agreement have held, and I don't think that agreement needs to hold absolutely. But I don't think that it's a matter of years beyond that deadline of May 2021 to either get a peace deal and get out with a deal or get out without a peace deal. I think it's a matter of some months, perhaps, beyond that of wiggle room. All of that means that the U.S. needs to focus in its policy development on options for pursuing its counterterrorism interests from outside Afghan territory. And we can get into that a bit later if there's time. I don't think this is a policy proposal that means the U.S. abandoning Afghanistan. The U.S. should continue to provide development assistance, and it should, to the extent acceptable to Afghans, continue to provide security assistance to Afghanistan on the basis of a political settlement. Afghan leaders on both sides of the conflict recognize very well that their country is extraordinarily dependent on external resources, and they welcome, including the Taliban, has welcomed a continued relationship with the U.S. But I am suggesting a kind of policy that would have the U.S. normalizing its relationship with Afghanistan by moving away from a posture of propping up a government that has not proven to be self-sustaining.
Thank you very much, Laurel, for your opening remarks. We're going to move now to a portion of the debate where for 2 to 3 minutes on each side, both Mike and Laurel can either respond to the statements that each side has made, pose questions to each other, or just otherwise engage with each other on the points that have been raised so far. So Mike, over to you for about 2 to 3 minutes to respond or to engage Laurel. Over to you.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Laurel. And not surprisingly, I agree with 90 to 95% of what you said, but in the spirit of debate, perhaps let me try to mention a couple of points where there may be some slight differences of opinion. First of all, and importantly, on the February 29th agreement between the United States and the Taliban, as you say, signed just this year in Doha, and not involving the Afghan government, of course, as we understand the phasing of this peace process. I have read the document several times. I am not as expert in that document as you, but I believe it lends itself to multiple interpretations about the degree to which American and NATO troop withdrawals are obligatory. And I'm talking about a much more open-ended kind of interpretation than just sliding the departure by a few months. As I read this document, the 4 big elements of a peace process have to be part and parcel of a single integrated outcome. And it is not until there is a successful negotiation on power sharing that I interpret the document as binding the United States to be willing to remove all of its forces. And I think the United States government should actually be clear on this point, because right now we've tried to sort of have it both ways and let anybody interpret the February 29th document how they wish. Most people in the press and elsewhere interpret it the way, Laurel, you've said, but I believe there is literally speaking another interpretation which can be justified by the document, which could then give us substantially more flexibility. But secondly, I agree with your point that in the long term, if there's an agreement, we have to expect we're going to leave. I might prefer to be able to stay with a small counterterrorism presence, but unless a future power-sharing Afghan government requested that, or unless we somehow had a different kind of relationship with Pakistan by then, the United States, I believe, would have to pull out of South Asia with its military and intelligence capabilities and hope that the partner nations in the region could adequately prevent the future development of a sanctuary by an ISIS or Al-Qaeda-like force. So I accept your point that there really is no long-term viable U.S. presence after a deal that we can count on. However, in the interim period, which could be 5 to 10 years, I would come back and make a third point, which is I'm not sure why this has to be something that we talk ourselves out of sustaining. The American politics of this are not at all difficult, as I see them. Afghanistan doesn't come up very much. There's no intensity around the issue in those who oppose the war. A lot of people are frustrated by the war, but you don't see million-person marches on the mall over this. You don't see a lot of pressure on Joe Biden to go lower than Trump or higher than Trump in terms of his troop presence or his recommended time duration. So I think American policymakers can do what's right and not feel they have to make a decision based on a politically, sort of ticking hourglass of American public support. American support for this war has been unenthusiastic for a long time, but Americans are also pragmatic, and they recognize that sometimes you have to choose the least bad option, which is sort of where I think we are now. One final last word would be on Pakistan. You and I have both alluded to it. It probably deserves a lot more discussion than we've given so far. But I would simply say one more thing that could change in our favor over time, and I'm not predicting that it will, but it could, is a different Pakistani view on the value of the Taliban to them and the value of playing this war both ways, helping NATO at times, but keeping the Taliban on life support or more at other times. And one of the reasons I would want to sustain an American patience and commitment is in the hope that Pakistan will come to realize a negotiated settlement is in its interest as well. We see some movement in that direction already. I think over time we might see more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. Over to you, Laurel, for 2 to 3 minutes to engage with Mike's points or raise your own questions. Over to you.
Sure, I think I will engage with those. First of all, on the text of the U.S. Taliban agreement and how to interpret it, I would agree that there's some ambiguity in how it's drafted. That wasn't your term. I'm using the term ambiguity. I think it was intentionally drafted with some ambiguity. Whether that's creative ambiguity or simply ambiguity because there was not fully a meeting of the minds is an open question to me. And I think we've already seen, I know we've already seen in the months since that was signed, that some of the ambiguity is truly that there were different views of what was agreed, and it wasn't simply providing cover for what was actually agreed. We've seen this in the ongoing wrangling that's just now almost resolved over a prisoner exchange issue that was agreed. One of the things that I think you can take away from that wrangling over the past months is that the Taliban is taking the narrowest, most literal interpretation of what is in that agreement. Now, looking at it from their perspective, I don't think you can fault them for that. The agreement is susceptible to that narrow, literal interpretation. And so this is why, while I will say that I think there's some wiggle room in the agreement, given all the deadlines that have slid, I don't think it's an endless amount of wiggle room. And ultimately, if the U.S. takes an interpretation and asserts an interpretation in the agreement that's greatly at odds with what the Taliban thinks they agreed to, then it's going to be seen as bad faith whether the U.S. can technically make that argument or not. Now, I mean, it's not really a binding agreement anyway. It's a political agreement. Moreover, it's a political agreement not even between two states, between the United States and a non-state entity, which is a bit unusual in international practice. It's not a treaty. There's no enforcement mechanism. No one's coming after the U.S. If it doesn't comply. It's only as good as the willingness to abide by whatever was, in fact, the good faith understanding that was reached. And my reading of it, even if you can find some hooks for alternative interpretations, is that the good faith understanding of what was agreed was that there would be a complete U.S. withdrawal on a specified timeline, because in fact dates were referenced in the agreement. But as I said, that doesn't mean there's no wiggle room at all. Finally, I would just, I think maybe we can talk a little bit about Pakistan in the next round, because you raised some interesting points there. But I was interested in the comment you made in your opening about remembering the history of earlier U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and the ways that that Afghans helped the U.S. win the Cold War. My takeaway from that history is rather different than yours. My takeaway is that's proof of the flexibility and fluidity of alliances in Afghanistan and who can and can't be a partner of the United States. It's important to remember that some of the people that we worked with, the United States worked with at that time, later became outright adversaries of the U.S., to include, even setting aside al-Qaeda figures, to include the Haqqani family, what we now call the Haqqani network. And so, you can make of that different conclusions, but to me, it doesn't suggest that there's a loyalty that the United States owes to the current constellation of actors in the Afghan government. It does suggest that, from a very crass, realistic perspective, there might be a variety of kinds of opportunities for the U.S. to build partnerships with different characters there.
Thank you so much, Laurel. We're now going to enter the final portion of this debate, where each side will have 2 to 3 minutes to wrap up, offer final thoughts on each side's mind, or perhaps raise even final new points. So over to you, Mike, for 2 to 3 minutes for your concluding remarks.
Let me pick up, please, where Laurel left off. And I agree that we don't want to make too much of this sort of deep moral bond between the United States and Afghan freedom fighters, or mujahideen as we knew them at the time, who have, in many cases, of course, moved on to a different, happier place since this was 30-some years ago. Many are no longer alive on Earth. Many have shifted allegiances, watched out for themselves, joined the Taliban or the Haqqani network. But I think it's important just to remember the history. And I'm sure, Laurel, you agree with me on that. You know the history so well. Just because a lot of people view Afghanistan as this remote, forsaken corner of the earth. And in fact, there is a history that has been important. And Afghanistan has strangely punched above its geostrategic weight a number of times in history, including, of course, with the 9/11 attacks. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind. But I also don't want to make too much of, so here I'll sort of come full circle to explain the circumstances, Laurel, under which I would agree that we've tried as long as we can, and that maybe we have to just take the risk of pulling the plug on the U.S. military presence. If, for example, we get to another standoff where the Afghan government divides against itself, and that remains the new reality for some period of time, the way that President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah couldn't agree on who had won the election last year and actually formed competing governments for a time. If that continued for a while, that would be a problem, and we couldn't sustain a government like that. If there were much worse abuse of power or much worse corruption, if there were an unwillingness to think about how to let certain Taliban fighters at least stay in their current locations in the initial phases of a peace deal, as we gradually stitch together some kind of a sort of ceasefire in place that over time could merge into a actual integrated Afghan security force. In other words, there are going to have to be some very tough compromises. Your excellent RAND study is a good place to look for what those might look like. If the Afghan government shows complete intransigence over a period of time at being willing to make any reasonable compromises, then I would come around perhaps closer to where you may be already, Laurel, and say that, yes, we have to look for other ways to maintain our minimal counterterrorism interest in South Asia, because we can't do something that becomes impossible to do. And this particular part of the world is important, but it is not the most crucial area for American strategic interests. And I'd like to keep a counterterrorism and security assistance outpost in South Asia to complement our comparably large presence in Djibouti or Iraq or Qatar or Kuwait. But if we can't, then we're going to have to go find second best backup options. And at that point, I would support those as well. But for the next 3 years, I think we should recognize this peace process is likely to be slow and give it some time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And Laurel, over to you for the final word.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hardest question here is how much time to give it. And I want to be clear that I don't think it would be an easy decision for the United States to pull out, having judged that it gave it enough time and it's just not, and it being the peace process is just not going to work. I do think that you're correct that peace processes take time. And it took over a year for the US and Taliban to negotiate their deal, which was really relatively simple. And now there's been 5 months delay in getting the Afghan peace talks started. And so we're just at the starting gates of something that has been, where efforts have been made to get this going for many, many months now. So I don't want to by any means suggest that there isn't risk, cost for the United States and for Afghans, for sure, if the U.S. did pull out sooner rather than later without a peace deal in place. But I also think that there is more clarity needed as to the length of time the U.S. is willing to stay and under what conditions in order to force deal making on the basis of what the real balance of strength is in Afghanistan, and to force a situation, as painful as it may be, where there is an Afghan level that is achieved in terms of the arrangements that are put in place, that an Afghan sustainable arrangement there. Because if there isn't that kind of clarity about where the US stands as to how much longer, with some reasonable degree of flexibility, how much longer it's willing to go, then I don't think you're going to get to that place where there is realistic decision-making and realistic bargaining by Afghans.
Well, with that, we've reached the end of our debate and discussion. Thank you both very much for this fascinating conversation. I know we could devote hours to various dimensions of this conversation, but you've given our audience a really fascinating overview of the issues and a really compelling debate and conversation to ponder over as we continue to think about this really interesting set of issues in this country. So with that, thank you again for watching. My name is Adam Twardowski. This has been More or Less, Debating America's Role in the World. We hope you join us again for our next installment soon.